Hello, and welcome to Freelance Frontiers, a weekly conversation navigating the future of flexible work. I am Ray Hames. I am an agency expat, a brand side leader, and a former freelancer myself. And I'm here with Nick Hammond. Hey, Nick.
How's it going?
Nick is a career freelance creative turned coach. We are here to chat about both sides of the freelance relationship, and we hope that our listeners will find something in here that helps them smooth out the bumps along the road working with and as freelancers.
And if you have any feedback, insights, questions, or would like to join us on a future episode, drop us a DM. So today we're talking about something that's both complex and also very simple at the exact same time, and that is how money motivates us. So I think our first little bit here is maybe talking about setting rates as freelancers. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I am part of a handful of different freelance communities, and it's something that comes up constantly. People are constantly asking for advice about if, when, and how to raise their rates. What would you tell them?
Yeah, so the difficulty here is that I feel like this is one of those questions within not just the design community, but freelance as a whole, that everyone wants one singular system to rule everything. And I just don't think that that is ever the actual case. So my answer is always it's specific to each freelancer, because each freelancer is, you can treat them basically as their own business, and you can't ever expect one business to be the same as another business. They have different networks, skill sets, they're serving different industries, the whole nine yards. So my only real rule of thumb here is if you've completely maxed out your time and you're still getting requests, that's when you can raise your rates. And that's kind of my
Totally agree.
baseline. Anything else there is always just, it depends.
Yeah, I think that that's spot on. And it's interesting because obviously when you make the jump to freelance, most of us, I guess Gen Z, a lot of people are straight out of school going freelance, so they don't have a ton of benchmarks to go from. But a lot of us have made the transition to freelance roles coming from salaried positions. And, you kind of start off in that world doing a little bit of the math to say, well, what do I need to be making by the hour to cover my costs? There's calculations that you can do to figure out kind of what's your base rate, right? That's like setting your initial rate. There's plenty of tips like look, you know what I mean? There's rate calculators out there. There's resources you can say, what is a visual designer in Colorado make per hour? But when the question comes like, okay, I've been working at this for a while, I'm thinking of raising my rates, I think that your advice is spot on. If you've got enough business to justify it, then great. And if you're still kind of, scrimping by month to month, hoping for new work, your books aren't full, and you're not making as much as you want because you're not filling your hours a week, that's a sales issue, not a pricing issue. You might be overpriced. And I think that I would urge people to be humble on that front as well. I've been overly ambitious about what I've charged. So don't be like me. I would say the caveat here that I'd throw in just like right now, because the market is so fickle, is make sure that if you're at a point where you think that you're going to raise your rates, you've done enough kind of evaluation of, can I justify this? Make sure that you've got enough work in the pipeline at your current rates that you would have a safety net in place if one of your client drops out because they can't afford your new rates. The economy is wild right now, and I am the last person to be able to predict what's going on. But I think from a security standpoint, I would say don't just across the board raise your rates 20% and assume that all of your clients are going to stick around at that new rate, because they may not be able to afford it. Yes. And I also think that it's worth having these discussions. Like, we're recording this in November, so this may be different if folks are listening later in the year or early next year. But I think it's worth having discussions with clients really proactively as they're firming up annual budgets, because it's a lot easier to get approval saying, hey, starting in the new year, my rate's going up 10%, versus you coming back in January saying, hey, starting this year, I'm raising my rates, because their budgets are already locked in at that point. And it's so much easier and helpful to get ahead of that conversation by talking to them sooner than later, because then they can bake those updated rates into their annual plans.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is another bit of that raise your rates conversation that can be difficult, because you don't ever really exist in a vacuum. And so, even if you raise your rates a little bit beyond what the market is willing to pay, you can kind of price yourself out of a lot of opportunities. And so I always tell freelancers that one of the key pieces of this is always having some sort of pulse on the market of where other people are coming in and what businesses are willing to pay. Because yeah, if I want to keep trying to raise my rates, which is obviously everyone's goal, but you're hitting some sort of recession or difficulty within a market where they're not willing to pay that rate, you can ask for that all you want, but you're not going to get it. And so you're always kind of having a gut check between where do I want to go and what can I actually get.
And there is that dynamic, and it's just subjective based on your clients, because we've all charged pain in the ass rates. I'll do this work, but you're going to pay extra, you know, yep. And that is, that's the truth. But you've got to be ready for that PITA rates to result in a client ultimately saying, this isn't going to work out for our budget. You can't count on that. So it's just something to keep in mind as you propose those updated fees.
Yeah, that's funny. I feel like it's definitely a chess move too. And I do think that a lot of times when you do get to the point where you're charging those pain in the ass rates, it's usually because you see some sort of writing on the wall and you're like, well, I'm just going to kind of ride out whatever the last few steps of this are and see what comes of it. And I think usually if you're to that point, you know that you're ready to let it go.
Yeah, definitely. Oh. Yeah.
But Ray, I'd love to get your point of view on how clients set budgets for freelancers. Can you walk us through who's making decisions and what the process looks like more on the brand side?
Yeah, and I guess I'd use your classic line of it depends based on client size. When I have worked at smaller agencies, for example, we've been working backwards based on a known project budget. So a client's hired us to do a campaign. We're, you know, for the overall agency rate, let's call it a flat fee of $100K. We have an agency profit margin we've got to try to protect. Let's call that 30%. Most agencies are running really thin these days and not getting that. But let's say that's the goal. So we've got $70K to invest in the team. And some of that's going to be taken by the full-time team that's dedicated to the project. Some of it's going to be dedicated to the freelance support that's needed to produce a campaign. Ultimately, that's how you start. That's how you back into what your overall project budget looks like. And then it's divvied up kind of by role and expenses. Like on any given campaign, there's hard costs. If you're going to do a shoot, you know, a photo shoot or a video shoot, you've got to pay location fee. There's hard costs, right? And then there's the people who are involved with the work. And at that point, you're kind of just penciling in rates based on what your known thresholds are. Last time we hired a video editor, they cost $80 an hour. So that's what I'm penciling in. It's not super educated. And that can be an issue, because that's why rates, you know, feel like they're stagnant, is because everybody's benchmarking based on past spend.
Yep.
When you're in a bigger organization, what I have seen is that finance is controlling the budgets, you know, and let's say you're not an agency that's protecting a profit margin. You are a brand that has a specific budget for your, you know, for your marketing team for a year. And your CFO is saying, okay, I've built a plan for this business to reach profitability, to hit our revenue goals. Whoever I'm, you know, if I'm a public company, I've got to answer to the board and to shareholders. And the CFO controls what department gets what funding. And so then as the CMO, I say, okay, great. I have a team budget of $5 million this year. I know that the business goals that we are going to be responsible for are X, Y, and Z. And I've got the full-time team to support some of those needs. The rest of this is going to get divvied up into a contractor freelance budget that I am going to be evaluating on. Again, it's kind of a waterfall approach. Here's what I need to spend on this project. This is a Q1 project, so it's going to be rush. I need to factor in, I need more hands on deck. I need to pay rush fees. It's going to be more expensive for me to hire quality freelancers with little time notice. So, you know, I'm probably going to be spending more at the first half of the year than I am in the second half. That's usually kind of the pattern, to be honest. especially because as a year goes on and a company, especially public companies, evaluate their profitability, they're dialing down budgets quarter by quarter to hit their end of year goals.
Yep.
So, your best, this is kind of like it's not a secret because it's obvious, but it's one of the things that freelancers, if you can get ahead of getting assigned into projects in Q1 and Q2, those are going to be like marginally more likely to stay on track than if you book in kind of last minute on Q3 projects. Those are get squirrely about how dependable they can be. I'm sure you've seen that.
Absolutely.
And so ultimately, a lot of this kind of planning for freelance budgets comes down to, are you beholden to a profit margin? And how does that break down into your team? Are you looking at past benchmarks and how recent are they? Are you going back to the same people? Are you looking for people at the same skill level or seniority? If not, you got to be realistic about where you're finding your own benchmarks. If I'm a CMO building back into my budget and saying, the last time I hired a dedicated, type artist was 4 years ago, I don't have a realistic idea of what I should be paying for that now. I'm going to have to do some research before I put out, a job description, before I go out to my network saying I need somebody to do this. Because I need to build my awareness around that.
Yep.
So it is a bit of a budget puzzle.
Absolutely.
I think, and I think it's interesting because one of the other variables that we talked about this a couple weeks ago, was the idea of flat rate versus project fees. And it's so interesting because I think there's like a real emotional dynamic to those setups, as well as a really pragmatic one. Both for brands and for freelancers. Like, how are you working on flat fees for anything? And like, how do you approach hourly versus project rates?
Yeah, I thought it was funny that you used the word squirrely for, the budget on the brand side, because I feel like in my response, would use the word squirrely for how I, approach the actual costing too. But I think it's for all of the reasons that you were explaining on the brand side, which is like so much of it depends on what's happening internally within the company and where they need to go and what resources they have. And a lot of times, if you come into that environment as a freelancer and just say, I'm worth $100 an hour, boom, and you have no context around what you just gave them, it doesn't help you. It doesn't help them. There's nowhere to go from there. And so what I usually tend to do is kind of come in from the point of view of like, let me ask more questions and figure out where you're at and how you've come to the conclusion that you feel like you need my services. And then from there, we can figure out like, okay, what would a bucketed group of hours toward this singular project look like? And then you can kind of back into putting some sort of number onto that hourly, whether that means that you're backing into saying that this is the hourly rate that I'm going to get paid at, and that's how I get it or not. To me, it doesn't necessarily matter. All that matters to me is that we've agreed on what the rate is and that I'm going to get paid for it. And at the end of the day, if I execute on what I need to and we work to outcomes, all of that will kind of take care of itself. But for me, it's more like, how do I meet you where you're at and figure out what situation you're in, where the budget is at, and how I fit into that. And I think a lot of times it comes down less to like billing hourly versus project and more like, what do you have for this specific project itself? And then how can I kind of help you back into more deliverables, whether that's less because you have less of a budget, or potentially backing into like more hours to work toward an outcome if you really want it to be more of an ongoing thing. So to go back to exactly what you were saying before, it depends.
Yeah. That's the magic phrase of the day.
Yep. So how do client side teams kind of see the difference between a flat rate versus an hourly rate, and kind of like, what's your gut reaction to how I approach my answer?
Well, I think, for me, it's like zooming up more at a philosophical level. I personally think that as an industry, making a shift to project-based fees is one of the most critical steps we can collectively take to building outcomes-based organizations and hybrid teams. Because an hourly model assumes that everybody's working 40 hours a week. It assumes a lot about, which I think is a totally archaic model for a million reasons. I don't think that that's what our economy should be based on. So I think that as we find ways to build project-based deliverables or outcomes as you know, as like the standard way that we all work together, the more it frees up freelancers time to have a more flexible relationship to work. It creates more dependable outcomes for companies based on a set investment. And again, it frees all of us up psychologically from this like literally archaic shackles of a 9 to 5.
Mhm.
But I think it's really hard work to put into practice. And I think that most accounting systems are still on an hourly rate. They're still comparing when you say, does it make sense for me to bring on a long-term contractor or hire this person full time? You're comparing an hourly rate to a salaried role, you know, and I think that there's those systems just aren't widely adopted to be looking at project-based work. I think that what's critical to make project-based work succeed is a really crisp shared understanding of what is going to come from that project and what you're going to get as part of the experience. So where we see project work fall down all the time is like rounds, right?
Mhm.
Okay, I'm going to pay you $5,000 for a Squarespace website, but I'm going to be a nightmare client. I'm going to send 7 different copy decks. I'm going to ask for, you know, change this image. Oh, find me something else. Oh, I don't like that font.
Yep.
And, you know, it's a how long is a piece of string conversation. And until that Squarespace website is launched and live, I paid $5,000. I can do whatever I want until, as the client, until I'm happy with that. That's a nasty relationship that doesn't set anybody up for success.
Yep.
And I think that the onus is certainly on the freelancer to have guardrails. Say, I will create a Squarespace website for you. Here's what you need to give me up front. You have 2 rounds of review that includes this type of feedback. Any feedback that falls outside of this results in a change order. And on the client side, you have to see that not as, you can see that as very punitive, like, you know, kind of your responsibility, like, oh, so many rules around this project. But you need to see this as a framework for successfully delivering your website within a shared timeline and budget.
Yes.
You know, and knowing that it's a 2-way street to produce work together, you have to come to the table with the right amount of input up front, and you have to consolidate your feedback and thinking to give fair and timely feedback. And that's how to be a good project manager in the first place. So, you know, I think it's a give and take of a success to how to make flat fee projects successful. But ultimately, again, kind of going back to my soapbox moment, I think it's the right way that we should be moving forward to build a more flexible relationship to work. And if we're all bought into that philosophy, that's like how we should be trying to work together.
Yeah.
I'll step
And I
off the
think
soapbox.
but yeah, you brought up so many like difficulties of how that transition plays out, right? And I think there's things that on the freelance end that I'll do to try and mitigate some of those things, which is like, you know, if I'm feel like I'm not getting enough information from someone to move forward the right way within a project-based type of environment, I'm going to absolutely give, you know, whatever C-level person is in charge of that work, I'm going to give them homework and say, hey, I need you to fill this out to help get me back on track and figure out where we're going to go. And a lot of times what I'll do is that kind of crawl, walk, run model of, hey, I'm not going to agree to this huge, like $30,000 project right out of the gate because I don't know how we work together. I'm down for, you know, a couple grand at a time and figure out like, where is this going to fall apart and how do we work through it before I all of a sudden agree to this massive project. And now
Right.
I'm on the hook for all these things. You're mad at me. I'm mad at you. How do we work through this when there's, you know, a huge price over our heads with some of this stuff? So yeah, there's so many little nuances to figuring out how to navigate that the right way.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that as with almost any successful relationship, it comes down to communication.
Agreed. Well, awesome. I think that's about all the time we had for today. It was a great chat.
Great chat, as usual.
Yes. If you found this useful or not, follow us here and over on LinkedIn for more tips on how you can get the most of working with and as freelance talent.
Have a great afternoon. We'll chat soon.
Bye.